We rely on testimony. Whether it's a friend, a witness to a crime, or an expert in a given field, we depend on what other people tell us. But sometimes people lie or mislead. Sometimes being open-minded, perhaps what a politician or a salesperson say, is tantamount to the intellectual vice of gullibility. In this lecture, Professor Peter Graham will explore some of the philosophical difficulties surrounding testimony and its implication for intellectual humility. Peter Graham is a professor of philosophy and the Associate Dean for Student Academic Affairs for the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at the University of California, Riverside. He earned his PhD from Stanford University, and he has written on skepticism, testimony, epistemic entitlement, biological functions, and topics in the theory of linguistic communication.
What exactly is testimony? Well, if you're like me, the first time you heard the phrase, you thought it had to do with a courtroom, something that happens in courtrooms that witnesses provide to a jury to make a decision. Well, that's one use of the word testimony. And if you thought that was what I was going to talk about, you'd think I'm a lawyer. And what do lawyers have to do, if anything, with humility? Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a philosopher. And in particular, I'm an epistemologist. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that asks, what is knowledge, and investigates the very nature of knowledge. So there are three fundamental kinds of knowledge. Abilities, knowing how to do something. Acquaintance, or knowing who or what something is. And knowing facts, propositional knowledge. The main area of inquiry for the branch of epistemology has been factual knowledge. How do we know that something is the case? And what is it to know that something is the case? So what is factual or propositional knowledge? Well, firstly, to know a fact or a proposition, you've got to believe it. If you don't have a belief, a view, an opinion on the topic, then you're not in a position to know the fact. You're just not even thinking about it. So you've got to at least think about that fact, where your thought, your belief could be true, it could be false. That's what gets you into the ballpark for knowledge. But in addition, your belief has got to be true. That is, your opinion or your view on the world has got to be accurate or correct. Because if it's mistaken, well, clearly you don't know. If you think the movie starts at 7 p.m., that's your view on the facts, and you show up and the movie started at 6:30, you were simply mistaken. You didn't know the time the movie started. So you've got to have an opinion, and that opinion, that belief or view, has got to be true. Your mind must match the reality in order for you to have knowledge. But it can't be just a lucky guess either. So sometimes we just guess. We think, well, most movies start at 7, I think. So I think the movie starts at 7. And you show up at 7, and that's the time it starts. So you got it right. Your view matched reality. But really, you didn't know. You were just guessing. So to know, you've got to have a view that matches reality, that is based on evidence or reasons. You must have a good ground to form your belief. And when you do, ordinarily we think you know. So knowledge is at least a belief that's true and that in addition is justified or based on evidence. So when I think about knowledge, I'm often thinking about the kinds of evidence that we possess that support our reasons for believing that something is true. There are all sorts of different kinds of evidence, and in particular, testimony is one of those, and so that's why I'm here to talk about testimony today. Testimony. Now remember I said testimony is what you would expect to find in the courtroom, where a witness says, I saw so-and-so commit the horrible deed. That's evidence to the jury. But that's just one form of testimony. That's testimony in a particular context. When philosophers talk about testimony, they actually mean something much broader than a kind of evidence in a courtroom. They mean learning anything whatsoever from another person telling you that it's the case. So I was born in California. You now know something about me. You didn't perceive my birth. I didn't perceive my birth. I certainly don't remember it. And I couldn't have perceived that it was in California, even if I could have perceived it. It was something I was later told by my parents. So I've told you something where I was born. You now know that through testimony. And I know it through testimony from my parents. And they probably know that they were in California from things that other people told them. So there are many things we know about ourselves that we can share with other people, that we know from what someone has told us, that I then convey to you by telling you. Testimony is the philosopher's expression for a way of coming to know things. So testimony is an enormous source of factual knowledge that we want to better understand. And that's my goal in this lecture, is to provide more information about the way philosophers have thought about testimony as a source of knowledge. So the epistemological question, that's what we're turning to now. When should you believe what another person tells you? Well, there are two views, and I'm going to pose them as two extreme views to make it very clear what the disagreement is. Historically, they're associated with early modern philosophers from Scotland. So one answer is associated with the Aberdeen philosopher Thomas Reid, and the other one is associated with the Edinburgh philosopher David Hume. Reid is on the side of it's being reasonable to just presume that other people are telling you the truth, that they're sincere, and that they're competent. You can just take it in. It's reasonable, just as it's reasonable to take perception at face value, to just assume that the world is exactly the way it looks to you, so too it's reasonable to just believe what other people tell you. That's the extreme version. Whether Reid held it doesn't really matter. It's just an example of a famous philosopher who was inclined in that direction. On the other hand, there was David Hume. David Hume is reported to have held that there's no species of reason more common, more useful, and even necessary to human life than the testimony of others. But even so, he disagreed with Reid. He thought, or it's reported that he thought, that you should be skeptical. You should not simply presume that the other person is sincere or competent or knows what they're talking about. You need evidence in favor of their sincerity. You need evidence in favor of their competence, and it's got to be evidence that you personally have acquired firsthand of the reliability and sincerity of this person that you're talking to, that you're believing, or the reliability of kinds of people or kinds of reporters on kinds of subject matters, or even the reliability of testimony, of communication in general. So Hume thought you need firsthand experience, your observation of the way people work, the reports about the world, that you have verified firsthand. You figured out, aha, he told me you can get haggis on a Tuesday at that restaurant. I went there and I checked on a Tuesday and he was right. So he's a sincere, reliable reporter, at least about haggis. Now I need to find out about other things. I need to do more verification of his reports before I really have evidence that he's to be trusted. And by acquiring all this firsthand evidence, one person after another, I get to a position where I've got justification for believing what other people tell me. So one extreme view associated with Reid is, it's okay, it's safe, just take it in. The other extreme view is, don't take it in at all. Don't believe any of it until you're in a position to independently verify by firsthand experiences stored in memory that people's reports correlate with reality, that people acting or talking or communicating in a particular way are sincere and they're competent on certain kinds of subject matters. So either default trust or default disbelieve until you've got evidence to overturn the suspension of judgment. So now we have an opposition. We have the view attributed to Reid, or the Reidian view, that you can just believe anybody, but that's crazy because as adults, we shouldn't just believe what anyone tells us. And then we've got the radical Humean view, or the view attributed to Hume, that we should never believe anyone until we've figured out firsthand that they're worthy of our trust. That view can't be right either. One view is too permissive, and the other view is too demanding. Of course, when you're in a situation like this, you know the truth must be somewhere in between. So I'm going to start arguing for a kind of compromise. And the first part of the compromise is to say what's true in both views. What's true in the Humean view is that there are plenty of times when we should not simply believe what another person tells us because we know an awful lot about the way the world works. We know there are times where people are out to mislead us. We know there are times where they cannot possibly be correct, where they themselves don't have the evidence. And sometimes they just tell us something that conflicts with something we already believe. We have a case of disagreement. These are all cases where we should stop and think again before we believe what the other person tells us. But there's something right in Reid's position too. Notice the small child, in believing what their parent tells them, is acquiring information about the world. And the parent is caring for the child. And it's not just a family unit that's at issue, but larger units of other caregivers, of schools, of societies, of whole institutions that run by the sharing of information one person to another. We are a deeply social species where we depend upon each other's goodwill, each other's cooperation for our long-term existence. So if we're deeply social, doesn't it make sense that we can acquire information from one another? And if at times we're at odds with one another, which humans certainly are, doesn't it make sense to sometimes stop and be skeptical? So there's something very true in Reid's idea that it's okay to take information in from one another because of the kinds of creatures that we are, social creatures. And there's also something very true in Hume's idea that we shouldn't always just believe what another person tells us because we're not simply social, but we've got our own interests, and we're also very fallible. We end up making mistakes about a number of things. So we need to understand how these two pieces of the puzzle fit together to explain why believing what another person tells you is a reasonable thing to do, and so a source of knowledge about the world. Somewhere in between is the truth. What exactly is the truth that's in between? What exactly explains why we're justified in believing what other people tell us? I want to answer that question by first answering a different question, an analogous question. One area where we're forming beliefs and acquiring knowledge, that is, we're getting the evidence, where we end up forming opinions and views about the world that is accurate so that our mind matches reality, is vision. Vision is extremely reliable. We move around our environment, relying on vision, and our other senses as well. So we can hear things, we can smell things, touch things, and taste things. But vision for human beings dominates our sense of the world. And it really tells us where things are, how they're moving, how far away they are, what their colors and shapes are. It's an impressive psychological ability. Why is it so good? What explains the reliability of perception? That is, what explains why our perceptual representations, our experience of the world, accurately depicts the world? Why is that the case? Well, just think about the evolution of mammals. Mammals rely on vision to get around in the environment. They're smaller creatures in comparison to some of the large creatures in our evolutionary history. They may have a number of predators out to get them. They may have prey they need to stalk in order to survive. So there's a strong evolutionary pressure to take advantage of information about the environment that comes through light and exploit the regularities in the environment to create perceptual systems that reliably detect and track the features of the environment so that those mammals, including human beings, might survive and flourish in their environments. So there's a very strong evolutionary explanation for the reliability of our perceptual capacities. And when we're thinking about knowledge, we're often interested in why are those capacities so reliable? Well, that's the perceptual case. We're wondering about the case of forming the beliefs on the basis of testimony. Someone tells you something, you believe them. So what explains why testimony is so reliable, or at least reliable enough? It turns out this is a difficult question. Even so, the social sciences are suggestive. There are many potential answers that help us make sense of the reliability of testimony and can help us understand why it is it's a source of knowledge. So what are some of those explanations in the social sciences? Well, let's think of communication, sharing information, or at least sharing apparently good information through communication, is a form of cooperation or coordination. I'm telling you something so that we can act together. Or you're asking me for something, you want my help, and so I tell you that something is the case, and you believe me because you think I'm being helpful. At least that's often the case. So what explains why humans communicate effectively? Why do they cooperate? Why do they coordinate? There are a number of explanations of cooperation in general that you'll find in the evolutionary sciences as well as in the social sciences. What are some of those general explanations? Well, the first one that gets covered is called tit for tat, or just trading. I give you something, and I remember that I gave it to you, and you remember that I gave it to you. And so in a way, you owe me something. And if you give me something back, then we'll continue to exchange. But if you don't give me anything back, I'm not going to trade with you again. And if in fact I don't think you would ever give something back, I won't give you something in the first place. And it turns out with enough memory and shared interests in cooperating and in trading, you can get a kind of evolution of cooperation in this way. So tit for tat, that's one way to do it. In a large enough group, I might also develop a reputation for being someone who can be trusted, someone who is a cooperator. So if I help one person and you're watching me help them, then you'll think I'm a helper. So in the future, when I need something, you might give it to me, thinking, because of my reputation, because of what you've observed, that I'll help you in return. That's called indirect reciprocity, a kind of indirect trading. And that's another way that helpful behavior can evolve in all sorts of species, and in particular in human beings. There are other strategies too. Coordination, for example. Suppose I am flying into your city and you're going to pick me up. And you want to pick me up because you want me to help you build a house. Maybe I'm an expert house builder and that's why I'm flying in. Now I'm going to tell you the time that my plane arrives because I want you to pick me up. Why would I lie to you about the time the plane arrives? If I did, I might sit there for hours waiting for you to get me. Because we need to coordinate and act together, we need to share information, and so I'm going to tell you the truth. And oftentimes we're coordinating, so I've got a very strong motive to tell you exactly what I believe is the case so that we can effectively work together. So the first answer, tit for tat, sometimes we're just trading, and as long as we've got memory of who we've traded with, it's in my interest to trade with you, and so it's in my interest to help you in general, and so giving you accurate information is a way of trading with you, hoping that you in turn will give me accurate information when I need it. I might give a third party accurate information so that you'll observe me, so I'll develop a reputation for someone who gives accurate information, who's sincere, honest, competent, and so on. And then other times we're just coordinating. So those are three answers that explain why we might be truthful in communication. However, we're often truthful to strangers. I might walk up to a complete stranger and ask for information, and that person will just give it to me. That person is never going to see me again. I'm never going to see them again. We're not trading. There's no one around to observe us. It's not a question of indirect reciprocity, and there's no joint plan that we have. We're not coordinating. So why would people be trustworthy in those kinds of situations? Well, it turns out that humans care about what other people think about them. I know this is not a surprise to you, especially if you have teenage children. They're constantly telling you they need a new type of tennis shoes because all their friends have those types of tennis shoes. They have to have them because they don't want to suffer the disapproval of having the wrong kind of tennis shoes. We have an enormous sense that what other people think of us matters to us, and we're constantly trying to manage our sense of their evaluation of our behavior, and we're constantly doing this to other people too. We're often thinking about what they're doing, even third parties that we're not interacting with. This fact about our psychology is something Adam Smith explored, and it's something that's very prevalent in the social sciences as a driving explanation for human behavior. Well, when it comes to telling the truth, to being sincere, we care about that a lot. If someone lies to us, we will disapprove of them strongly for the lie, and it may have further consequences. So often when someone just asks us for information, we will just tell them because we're built to be sincere, because we fear disapproval, and we want to earn their approval. And it may be just a generic tendency where we're not thinking about that person in particular, that it's their approval that we care about. It's just we don't want people to think poorly of us regardless. Even if we were to slip up and tell someone something inaccurate, being sincere, when it occurred to us later that we said something false and maybe they went to the wrong bus station as a result of our poor instructions, we feel embarrassed. We feel embarrassed even though they probably made it, they probably forgot who we are, and there's no chance that we'll ever see them again. So we've internalized these expectations of correct or appropriate behavior, and one of the strongest things we tell our children, and we tell other people, and we tell ourselves is to be honest. So honesty is a social norm. Tell the truth is an expectation we hold ourselves to, and we feel good when we do it, and we hold others to, and we disapprove of them when they fail to do it, and those emotions, those desires, often influence our behavior. So it's a part of the explanation for why we are sincere, why we tell the truth when we do. But that's not the only reason. Sometimes we're not even aware of that when we're being truthful. We just do it kind of automatically. Well, maybe we're built to be informative, sincere communicators, and we only learn later on when it's in our interest to lie. That is, we're naturally sincere, and only on special occasions or special types of people and special types of circumstances do we have a tendency not to tell the truth. So the student who's been accused of cheating, who's in front of the principal, that student has an incentive to lie on that occasion. But does that student lie all the time? Probably not. The student is probably sincere in almost every other context, except for maybe interesting contexts where we tell white lies, which vary what counts as a white lie and what doesn't, from culture to culture. And for the most part, we don't believe too much when people tell us a white lie. That is, we don't stake our lives on those, and we know that they're often being polite, trying to make us feel better. So the student often tells the truth. And maybe that's how we all are. Maybe, in fact, we are born to inform. So there are many things that we do by our nature, by our human nature, but perhaps our human nature as a social nature is such that we are born to be informative. And this takes us back to Reid's view. So Thomas Reid believed that we have a natural disposition to tell the truth, just as we have a natural disposition to believe what other people tell us. Those two combined mean, as social creatures, we're going to help each other out all the time. I can't know everything firsthand. I can't know that you're to be trusted firsthand, at least not in every case. But we need to share information with one another if we're going to work as a social being. Our societies depend upon an overall level of trust and informativeness, and it could be that we're that way by our very nature. So there are many possible explanations for the reliability of testimony. Does that mean in the end that the Reidian view is correct? Well, not exactly. It certainly doesn't support the strong Humean view where we need to figure everything out on our own as if we were individual atomistic creatures and not social creatures, simply thrown into a social environment. We can't believe what everyone tells us all the time. That's certainly true. So far, we've been working with the assumption that when we're forming testimony-based beliefs, we're just taking it in. But we're often not just taking it in, because we may have an opinion on the topic ourselves, or we may be aware that the topic is controversial. And those two pieces of background information are very important when we are deciding whether to believe another person. So if someone is talking about some new discovery in science, you might be interested in it, and whatever they say, it may not make a difference to you. But in some cases, it may make a difference to you. You may have some background knowledge about it, and instead of just believing them, you'll say, hey, that's pretty interesting. I'm not sure that's true. What's your evidence? What are your reasons? And what you're doing is what a psychologist might call argumentation. You're not getting in a fight. Hopefully you're not getting in a fight, but you're asking for their arguments, for their evidence, for their justifications. If they can provide it and it's convincing, you're likely to believe them because they haven't simply made an assertion. They've made a series of assertions that often support one another. they've given you a justification for forming that belief. If it's a good one, it seems very reasonable in that context to believe them. But imagine they give you a bad one. Or imagine when they're giving you reasons, you have background beliefs that conflict with those. Well, then you'll bring those to bear. You'll say, well, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about it. What about this other consideration? Now, if they can answer that and change your mind, then once again, they've given you an argument, justifications, or evidence, which would justify you in believing them. But if they can't, then maybe not believing them is the correct response, or at least suspending judgment, or possibly thinking that you need to do some more thinking about it yourself. So what often happens in those cases where we should not simply believe someone is that we're aware of the pressure to do more thinking about it ourselves, either to ask them for more evidence or to spend some time ourselves reflecting on the topic and doing our own inquiry into the evidence. So those are contexts where our own beliefs conflict with what they are asserting, or our own sense of how the topic requires a good deal of evidence before someone forms an opinion on it, that lead us to ask them for more reasons to argue with them, or to go out and acquire more evidence on our own. And that, it seems, is the exact correct response in those types of cases. So thinking about it more is often the right response. Reed is right that in many contexts, it's okay to just believe what other people tell you because testimony as a human practice is so very reliable. But Hume is right that you should not simply believe what other people tell you. You should rely on your track records, your knowledge of who's to be trusted and who's not. And furthermore, you should examine the evidence that they can provide or the evidence that you might acquire on that particular topic before you settle your mind. The truth is in the middle, but we should be assured that for the most part, testimony is a very effective way of coming to acquire knowledge about our world. What does all of this have to do with intellectual humility? That's a great question. I want to answer that question by first talking about something else, something that I've learned in my own life through my experience. I've learned that sometimes I'm right about things and sometimes I'm wrong about things. I've also learned, and I think you've learned this too, that it feels good to be right about things, and it often feels bad to be wrong about things. So when you're in a case of disagreement, how do you want to feel? Well, you want to feel good, so you want to be right. That's the best situation you could be in. And sometimes you may find yourself, when there's disagreement, getting defensive. And you're getting defensive because you want to be right. Because if you're right, you're going to feel good. And if you're wrong, you're going to feel bad. So you defend yourself to make sure that you're in the right. And you know what the other person is doing? They're doing the same thing. And often that leads to an argument in the bad sense. That is, it often leads to a fight. Is that the right response? When we think about intellectual humility, we're thinking about excellences or virtues of character, things that make someone a truly good person. Now, in the instance where you've got a disagreement with another person, what do we know? Well, we know, probably in most cases, one of you is right and one of you is wrong. So maybe it's you. Maybe it's me when I'm disagreeing with you. Well, either I'm right or I'm wrong. Those are the two choices in most cases. Well, if I'm being defensive and I'm wrong, am I going to be any better? No, because I might win the disagreement, but I'm still in the wrong, and I've missed an opportunity to go from a false belief to a true belief. I've missed the opportunity to be better off, to grow. And if I'm simply being defensive and I'm not really listening to your point of view, then I'm missing the opportunity to gain the kind of information that is leading you to believe as you believe. So I'm missing the opportunity to actually learn from you, even if you're mistaken and I'm correct. So what's the best response when you enter cases of disagreement with another person? Well, oftentimes it's to look for all of the evidence in an open-minded kind of way, open to the possibility that you might be mistaken, because there may be evidence that the other person has that with an open-minded response to the other person, you will acquire. So there's available evidence that when you start the conversation, you don't have. So the best response oftentimes to disagreement, where it feels good to be right and it feels bad to be wrong, is to be open to the possibility that you are wrong, because if you are, you're going to get more information and you're going to move from a false belief to a true belief, better supported by the evidence. You're going to grow. And that kind of growth is something you should learn to take pleasure in. You'll feel better when you're getting smarter. And further down the road, when there's another disagreement, you're more likely to be in the right, and it feels good to be right about things. So there are strengths of character that we can acquire, like openness to the evidence, that help us overcome our fear of being mistaken, because that doesn't feel very good, that over the long term means we're going to have more information and we're going to be in the right. That is, we're going to have more true beliefs and more awareness and acquisition of the available evidence, and so overall we'll be better off. Personal growth is a pretty good thing, even though sometimes it's tough. So developing a kind of intellectual humility when interacting with other people, openness to the evidence so that you're actually tracking the available evidence and not simply sticking to your guns and ignoring the possibility that there's more evidence to acquire, is a way of becoming a better person. And furthermore, from the point of view of learning from other people, it's a way of acquiring more information, even if their belief is false. Because in the example I just gave, they're believing it for reasons, and you're learning from them what their reasons are when you ask them. And either you're learning their mistake, or you're learning considerations that support a broader picture. So in a way, in the end, you're both right about it. You just saw different points of view when you started the discussion. What about going to the doctor? Many of us fear going to the doctor. I don't like going to the dentist because I know it's going to hurt, but sometimes we fear going to our physician because we fear that we have an illness, and we're so scared about it that we don't want it to be true. So we don't even go to the doctor out of that fear and anxiety. Is that a good response to our feelings? Was it a good response to argue with another person to make sure you were in the right? No, it wasn't. It's okay once in a while to be mistaken, even if it feels bad. Are we justified? Is it the right thing to do to not go to your doctor because you fear that perhaps you might have a sickness you really don't want to have? Is it better to be in denial so that you don't feel those feelings? Or should you go to the doctor? Well, let's think about it rationally. Either you have the illness or you don't. If you don't, having a doctor tell you don't is wonderful, because then the fear completely goes away and you feel fantastic. That is so much better than being in denial, because the fear keeps creeping in. But suppose you do have the illness. Well, if you do, you want it treated right away, and the sooner you treat an illness, the better. So either you have it or you don't. If you do, you want to find out, because you want to treat it immediately. And if you don't have it, you want to find it right out, because it eliminates all of the anxiety together. Either way, you are much better off going to the doctor. So these emotions, this fear, which prevents us from acquiring the available evidence, interferes with what is best for us. We will be better off by having that evidence. Intellectual humility is a real openness to the evidence, not just the evidence you have, but the evidence that's available in the context. Often we ignore that evidence because of our feelings, because of our fears, because of our overconfidence that we're right, or because of our underconfidence that we're in a position to know. Humility requires us to look for the available evidence and form our beliefs on their basis. This is the point of view argued for by Ian Church and Peter Samuelson in their book, which is the companion to this course, Intellectual Humility, an Introduction to the Philosophy and the Science. There's a few outstanding examples in the book that I want to go through because they bear on issues of believing on the basis of what other people tell you. Remember, the truth is in the middle. We often need to know whether the person we're talking to is trustworthy or not, and we need to rely on our own experience, our own evidence, and our ability to sift through the evidence to ask them questions and to follow up when there is disagreement in different cases. One of the obstacles to actually forming our beliefs on the basis of the available evidence, our background evidence, the evidence they happen to have, the evidence that's out there that supports or undermines their reliability, are our emotions, our fears, and sometimes our biases, and sometimes these biases come from our culture. So let me give you a couple examples involving our fears. One of the most controversial issues in America at this time is climate change. And it's surprising because when you look at the science is overwhelming that our climate is in fact changing. Whether it's man-made or not, it's happening, and it's something that we're all going to have to face collectively, not just country by country, but as a species around the entire globe. But many people won't believe it. So suppose you haven't even thought about it, but someone starts to describe it to you. And you think, oh my goodness, that means enormous changes to the environment, and it could mean enormous changes to agriculture, to our food supply, to where we live in cities, to migration patterns, and so on. It is scary, extremely scary, and you don't want it to be true. I don't want it to be true. None of us wants it to be true. Our fear then could lead many of us to think it's not going to happen. Our fear, because we want it to be true, that it's not going to happen, could lead us to look for evidence that it's not going to happen. So confirmation bias often happens. We want something to be true, and so we look for evidence supporting what we want to be true so that we're not scared anymore. But suppose you're talking to a scientist, and suppose this scientist has nothing to gain, and we all have so much to lose if climate change is true, and you ask them, what's the evidence? And they say the evidence is overwhelming that the climate is going to change in radical ways, maybe in our lifetimes, certainly the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. The world's going to be a very different place. And suppose you don't believe the scientists and you think, well, they're mistaken, they're not always right, and maybe this guy's lying to me. And you do that out of your fear because you don't want it to be true. Then your emotions are driving your response to the evidence, in particular, the available evidence. In a way, you're being overconfident that you're in the right when here's someone who's an expert in the sciences that you're simply ignoring. Think about it. We rely on scientists all the time. We got on airplanes and we fly around the world, and that's physics, that's engineering, that's computer science. We rely on scientists in so many ways, it's impossible to even count them all. But when we don't want what they're telling us to be true, we let our emotions drive our response. That's not the intellectually humble response. In a way, it's a kind of arrogant response that perhaps you're in a better position to know than the other person. So when we're responding to testimony, it's true that we often have to be on the lookout for possible signs of insincerity when we're trained to see them, or that we're on the lookout for possibly that they don't know what they're talking about and we need to ask them for their reasons. But in some cases, there's such a strong asymmetry between our position and their position, because they're really experts on the topic, that we would need extremely good reasons not to believe that person. Let's think about another case from the book by Church and Samuelson. Suppose you're going to buy a car, and you're not very good at telling whether any car is better than another car. But there's a particular kind of car you really want to buy. And you find that there's a used car salesman with a lot who's selling the kind of car you've always wanted. Maybe you've always wanted a 1984 Mazda GLC. I don't know why you'd want one of those, but you might. And you might see that this used salesman has one. And you go, and the used salesman tells you it's only ever had one owner, and that person hardly ever drove it. It's a fantastic car. You really should buy it at this great deal. And because you're anxious about it, but that's the kind of car you really want, you ignore all the evidence you've been given, all the advice from your friends that you should not simply believe a used car salesman, and you buy it, thinking not only did you get a great car, but you got a great deal. Those are cases oftentimes where we think you need to get a second opinion. Drive that car to a mechanic and get the mechanic's opinion. There's available evidence, that is, used car salesmen often have large motives to mislead you, and there's additional evidence that you can acquire from a second opinion from a mechanic that you trust that the car's a good one or that it isn't. If you simply insist on believing you bought a good car because you don't want to feel bad about being fooled, then you're not being intellectually humble. You're making the wrong response by not going out and making sure you've got all of the available evidence. Those are both cases where the hearer is responding in the wrong way to the speaker. In their book, they also discuss another case. This is a case discussed by Miranda Fricker in her book, Epistemic Injustice. And it's a great case because you can watch the movie. The case is from the movie The Talented Mr. Ripley. In that movie, there are four main characters. There's Mr. Ripley, there's his friend Dickie, there's Dickie's girlfriend Marge, and then there's Dickie's father, Mr. Greenleaf. Mr. Ripley is extremely charming. He comes from a non-privileged background, but he assimilates into this group of people, this group of friends that are very privileged, and Mr. Ripley wants to have the life that Dickie has, and he becomes Dickie's good friend, or so Dickie believes, and he charms Mr. Greenleaf, and Mr. Greenleaf thinks Ripley is a wonderful character. And then one day, Ripley kills Dickie to take over the kind of life that Dickie has been living. Dickie has disappeared. We know, watching the film, that Dickie's disappeared because he's been killed. The police start their investigation. Who should they be looking for? Well, they're looking for Dickie, and if Dickie's dead, they're looking for his killer, and then we know it's Ripley. But Mr. Greenleaf doesn't think it's Ripley because Ripley has so charmed Greenleaf. Marge, however, figures it out. She's aware of all the available evidence that suggests it's Ripley, and she takes this evidence to Mr. Greenleaf. But does he believe her? No, he doesn't believe her at all. He's been charmed, on the one hand, by Ripley, and on the other hand, he's full of prejudices and biases that prevents him from believing a woman.
Female intuition, and then there are facts.
Especially on a controversial topic, a topic she cares much about. He starts to believe that she's simply being hysterical and that women can't be trusted on these topics. He doesn't believe her at all because of his biases. It turns out there are many biases like this that we have, where we downgrade whether the person we're talking to is to be trusted or not. We think they're not in a position to know. Maybe it's a gender bias. Maybe it's a racial bias. Maybe it's a class bias. In all of these cases, there's a kind of arrogance that we possess, maybe not even knowing that we possess it, because of our biases, which means we will not believe certain kinds of people. We will not be forming beliefs on the available evidence, the evidence they possess, because we think they're not in a position to have it. That's a kind of failure to be intellectually humble. It's a failure to respond to the available evidence driven by our biases. And again, it's difficult to be aware of our biases and to overcome them. But more and more research is being done in the social sciences that help expose these biases, in particular the social science of social psychology, and we're developing techniques to train ourselves so that we're not tricked by those biases. And it doesn't feel good to be told that we've got these biases. Often they're gender biases or racial biases or class biases. But what intellectual virtue requires is that we overcome our fears, we overcome those emotions in order to grow. So just as we should go see the doctor to find out whether we're sick or not, that's the best thing to do, so too we should be open to the possibility that there are biases that cloud our judgments that prevent us from forming beliefs on the basis of the available evidence. Because when we do, we are better off overall. We acquire more information that helps us get more knowledge about the world, and so to make plans and judgments that are more likely to be effective. And people with that kind of information will become our partners in getting a better understanding of the world. I just gave three examples from the book by Church and Samuelson. The first was about climate change, and the second was about used car salesmen, and the third is from the movie The Talented Mr. Ripley. They all have to do with the here. There are cases where the here is not being intellectually virtuous by not responding to the available evidence. But there's also pressures on speakers. So hearers rely upon speakers for information. And there are tricks that often get used to get people to believe you. One trick that often we're not even aware of, just as we're not aware of our implicit biases, is confidence. One way to get someone to believe you is by presenting your evidence, by making your report or your assertion or giving your testimony in a confident manner. Confidence influences people. Often by being confident, we see that people believe us. And that's a kind of reward. It makes us feel good that we have that kind of influence, that we've been able to achieve our intended effect. And then we start being more confident when we're making our assertions. We could be entirely unaware of this, just as we're unaware of our implicit biases. So some of us, by being confident, have an effect on other people that we don't even know that we're having. Now, suppose you're not believing on the available evidence as a speaker. That is, suppose you're not being entirely intellectually humble and that you're being overconfident or perhaps underconfident vis-a-vis your evidence. But then you're very confident when you make an assertion. When you do that, you're going to get someone to believe on your belief, and if your belief isn't well based on the evidence, then the belief that they will inherit from you will not be well based on the evidence either. So if we're going to help other people by making assertions, instead of helping ourselves by feeling influential when making assertions, then we need to make sure that when we do so, that when we tell someone something, when we give testimony, when we make a report, that we really know what we're talking about. So we shouldn't be overconfident. Our confidence in our delivery should match our justified confidence in the evidence that supports our belief. This can be difficult to do so, and oftentimes it takes that kind of courage or open-mindedness to overcome some of our fears or anxieties. We're worried they might not believe us. We're worried they might disagree with us. We're worried they may not think well of us. And so we speak in a confident way to have that kind of influence on others. But sometimes we might be better off by signaling that perhaps we're not so sure, that perhaps the evidence could go the other way, or that we don't have all the evidence. And in that way, we're more likely to share what's likely to be true with another person and genuinely benefit them. So intellectual humility comes in not just for hearers when they are arguing with another person or filtering the reports or wondering whether to believe them, but it also comes in for speakers too. It's a joint enterprise, sharing information speaker to hearer, and not just two people, not just interpersonal, but larger groups, because you never know who you're going to talk to or who you're going to pass information on to that someone else gave to you. I don't mean to suggest that the kinds of issues that we're talking about are simple or just interpersonal. They're much bigger than that. And many of the issues we face, I just gave you the example of climate change, are issues that we all face that have to do with large social institutions that go well beyond just talking to one another, just acquiring information through testimony. But testimony is nevertheless one of those very interesting cases where we acquire information about the world. Remember philosophers, they ask big questions, very big questions. What is there? What should I do? What should we do? How do you know? And when it comes to knowledge, philosophers are very interested in knowledge of the world, propositional knowledge, not just of the physical world, but the social world too. I want to know about you just as you want to know about me. That kind of knowledge, factual propositional knowledge, is a true belief, a belief that matches reality, that's based on evidence. And what are the various kinds of evidence that we have? David Hume was right. He thought there was no species of reasoning more common, more useful, and even necessary to human life than the testimony of others. We are learning from one another as a social species all the time. It's extremely important that we're able to rely upon one another, which means it's extremely important that as hearers, we don't just believe what other people tell us, but also as speakers, we're providing useful information to others. We often fall short in providing the best possible information and forming the best possible beliefs in response to what other people tell us. Often they have motives to mislead. Often we have motives to ignore the evidence that they're providing. But the intellectually virtuous person overcomes those kinds of motives, usually their emotions, usually their fears, and it's difficult, it's demanding. But as we do so, we grow. Remember, for any particular case where you might be afraid of the evidence or you might be afraid of the conclusion, ask yourself, if it's true, what happens? And if it's false, what happens? And how am I going to be better off in those two types of circumstances? When you might be sick, go to the doctor. You'll be better off either way. And when there's amazing change to the entire world that could be right around the corner, that's another kind of case, though it may be very scary, we will all be better off if we know the truth about it.
How should we handle disagreement? People can disagree on just about any subject, and disagreement among peers, people who are equally familiar with relevant data and just as intelligent, clever, rational, and so forth, can be found in almost every realm of inquiry. In this lecture, Professor Catherine Elgin will explore the relationship between intellectual humility and how we should handle these sorts of disagreements. Professor Elgin earned her PhD in philosophy from Brandeis University, and she is now a professor of the philosophy of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is a philosopher whose areas of study include the theory of knowledge, philosophy of art, and the philosophy of science. Her recent work considers the questions about what makes something cognitively valuable, and she is the author of several books, including Considered Judgment, Between the Absolute and the Arbitrary, which she co-authored with Nelson Goodman, and With Reference to Reference.
Normally, we take it that we know rather a lot. We take ourselves to know, say, when the Battle of Trafalgar was, what the atomic number of gold is, when our mother's birthday is, who won last week's football game. And we have reasons, often very good reasons, for what it is we take ourselves to know. But typically the reasons are less than absolutely conclusive. Maybe there's a gap between the evidence and the conclusion. Maybe some of the evidence might be misleading. And maybe we're faced with the fact that other people disagree with us. This raises a serious problem. What should we make of the fact of disagreement? Should we hold fast to our views anyway? Should we go over to the other side? Should we simply suspend judgment given the fact that somebody disagrees with us? It's actually a very tricky question. And three possibilities seem logically available. One is to remain steadfast. Hold fast to what you know. You've got your reasons. You take it that they're good reasons. What more could you want? The second alternative is to be conciliatory. Suspend judgment, maybe, or at least moderate your view in the face of disagreement. The third is to concede. Admit that your opponent's right and just jump over to the other side. Now, it's not obvious that the same answer should be given in all of these cases. It may be that some disagreements call for one solution and some call for another. And I think that's probably right. So let's look at some cases. Suppose Hal's a bit of a hypochondriac. He's had a cough for several days and concludes immediately that, of course, he's got stage 4 lung cancer. What else could be the cause? Well, he goes to his doctor, and she tells him he's got a cold. Hal's never studied medicine at all. He should pretty clearly go over to the other side, admit that his physician knows what he's talking about, and he doesn't. But that's just one case. So let's consider another one. Suppose Jeff knows that he's competent with respect to a topic, and that Emily isn't. Maybe he's a chemist, she's not a chemist, and they're disagreeing about whether methane is an organic chemical. Maybe he's an avid football fan, and she knows nothing about football, and they're disagreeing about whether a player was offsides. He should probably hold fast to his views. her disagreement really is no reason to think that he might be wrong. But what about where people who disagree are equally competent? Then let's say they're intellectual equals. They've got the same evidence, the same background information, the same reasoning abilities. What should we think in that case? Well, even there are cases that we might want to distinguish. One would be the case where they're both, let's say, equally incompetent. So we have Pat and Mike who are studying Renaissance history, and they're both barely passing the course. Pat thinks that the Medicis were nobles. Mike thinks that they were commoners who were very powerful. What should they make of this disagreement? Well, probably they should suspend judgment. Their views on the subject are very, very precarious. That being so, anything should probably tip the balance to convince them that they don't know. Because their views are so precarious, they should go back and study some more. But what about where they pass some threshold for competence, where they're pretty much competent on the subject? And even here we've got problems. So here's a case considered by philosopher David Christensen. You have a bunch of people who go out to dinner, they have pizza, and they have the standard practice of splitting the cost equally. Fred and George are equally good at mental mathematics, and they're good at it. And standardly, they divide the cost in their heads, come up with the same number, and that's right. But tonight they disagree. So Fred thinks everybody should pay $6.37. George thinks everybody should pay $7.12. What should we do? Well, the answer seems perfectly obvious. You should suspend judgment, take out a pencil, and do the math. It's not that hard. You suspend judgment for a very short period of time and do something that's really quite easy, and you come up with an answer that everybody can be confident is right. So there's no problem there. Something similar can happen in some factual disagreements. If they disagree about when the Battle of Waterloo was, for example, well, pull out your smartphone, Google the answer, and you're home free. So in these cases, conciliating is seemingly the obvious thing to do because it's very easy to solve the question easily. Quickly, relatively cost-free, it's no big deal. But most disagreements are actually not like that. If you think about cases where you disagree with people, you find out that the situation is really quite different. Not all disagreements among intellectual equals are so easily resolved. And if we think about it, most of our disagreements with other people are not so easily resolved. So let's look at a different case. Suppose an animal horn with holes in it has been discovered in a Neanderthal settlement. This raises a problem for paleontologists because it's widely thought that Neanderthals did not have the intellectual ability to create music or the manual dexterity to finger a flute. On the other hand, this thing looks awfully like a primitive flute. And if they'd found it in a prehistoric Homo sapiens settlement, they would certainly have concluded it was a flute. So one paleontologist, let's say Dr. Adler, thinks it's a flute. We have to rethink our knowledge of the Neanderthals. The other, Dr. Eby, thinks it can't be a flute because our knowledge of Neanderthals is really pretty solid. The interesting thing about this disagreement, aside from the fact that we're assuming that both of these people are experts, is the fact that it might be irresolvable. There isn't that much evidence to be had about the Neanderthals. So there may be no confidence that we could do anything like Googling the answer or digging up more settlements or whatever and finding out once and for all what the answer is. But it's consequential because it's going to have reverberations for other things we think about prehistoric hominids. So it's rather serious, and it's not obvious what we should do in that case. Well, we should consider our three alternatives. Conceding has no appeal whatsoever. Neither one of the experts should simply jump to the other side, because each is and thinks of himself is as good as the other. Neither thinks he's relatively incompetent. So the two that remain are to ask about steadfastness and conciliation. So let's consider what's to be said for steadfastness. Suppose Professor Charles knows that he's considered the matter carefully and he's come to his conclusion. He's taken account of all the available evidence, he's accommodated the background reasons that are appropriate, and he concludes it's a flute. He knows that Professor Jones disagrees with him, and she's normally considered his intellectual equal, and he considers her his intellectual equal. So he's surprised and maybe a little bit dismayed that she disagrees, but he's dismayed that she's gone off on a false track. He doesn't think that her disagreement is any reason for him to change his view whatsoever. She's obviously made a mistake, so he'll remain steadfast. Unfortunately, she can take exactly the same position. She thinks he's usually pretty bright, knows what he's doing most of the time, but this time he's made some kind of unfortunate error. Maybe he was careless, maybe he wasn't paying attention. I mean, who knows? But she knows what she's doing, so she remains steadfast. Now, the problem with this is that this may make their disagreement completely irresolvable because neither one sees any reason to even take the other's consideration seriously. They're dismissive, they're dogmatic, they're intellectually arrogant, and they've closed off debate on the issue, basically. So this is not looking particularly good. They're apt to remain permanently at loggerheads with each other. They have no incentive to even consider the reasons the other person has in mind. And notice they're also both disrespectful. They say that they think of each other as intellectual equals, but when push comes to shove, they're inclined to just arrogantly dismiss the other person's views. So they actually are adopting a permanent position of superiority. This claim to equality is looking a little spurious here. So let's look at the case for conciliation. Like Professor Charles, Professor Hudson has thoughtfully and judiciously considered the issue, and she's well qualified to judge. She's taken into account the relevant evidence. She's accessed the background information. She's checked her inferences carefully. And left to her own devices, she'd be pretty confident in her conclusion. But Professor Black is her intellectual equal, and he disagrees with her. What should she make of that? She has no reason to think that he has been less careful and judicious than she was, that he was careless, that he was cavalier. She has no evidence of any of that. And she really does think they're equals. So she thinks she has no better reason to trust her judgment than to trust his. That's an intellectually humble position. The attitude is fallibilist. I think I know, but I might be wrong. She's respectful of Professor Black in that she's taking his views as seriously as hers, and she now wants to rethink the issue on the basis of their disagreement. Now, it might seem that this is the obviously right thing to do. I mean, particularly the way I said it. He's arrogant, she's humble, he's dogmatic, she isn't. We know who's nice here. But the question of whether this actually says anything about what they should do in the face of disagreement has at least one problem in simply going with the humble case, and that's the following. If you say that you should conciliate, you back off from the level of conviction you have in your judgment. And you may back off to the point of suspending judgment entirely, as we saw in the case of what we should think about the Renaissance, or you may just back off to the point of lowering the level of credence you have in your conclusion. But you may back off to the point where you no longer reach the threshold for knowledge. So we get the following, let's say, uncomfortable position. The intellectually arrogant person who is right gets to preserve his knowledge. He knows because he has sufficient reason, that is good reason, to support his true belief. The intellectually humble person may lose knowledge just by conceding that the other person might be right. And that's an epistemological cost. And it also may make the intellectually humble person look like a wimp. Every time there's a hint of disagreement, you go from, I might be wrong, to, okay, I won't believe it anymore, or I won't have strong confidence in it anymore. And that seems to be a bit of a problem. You don't seem to have the courage of your convictions if you can be moved so easily that way. So we shouldn't assume that there's an easy answer in favor of the conciliatory position. But I do want to say that there are some problems that need to be faced here. So I said when talking about the intellectually arrogant person that he may conserve his knowledge if he happens to be right. But this leads to a paradox, or at least a conundrum, that has been identified by Professor Saul Kripke. And that's the paradox of dogmatism. And it goes like this. If S knows that P, then P is true. Knowledge requires truth. If P is true, then any evidence against P is misleading, because P is true. And if S wants to retain her knowledge, she should disregard misleading evidence. So she should be dogmatic. She should simply, having come to knowledge, simply not keep an open mind to any evidence that might appear. Now, this is an uncomfortable position to be in. And it's uncomfortable not just because it seems crazy, but also because it throws a strong element of luck into this debate. Since if S knows, if Professor Charles knows, he should disregard the evidence. But we said that he had a counterpart who was his equal, who had evidence. And it seems a very uncomfortable position to be in. It's just lucky that he's the one who happened to get the right answer. So the suggestion is that this cheerful bit about we get to preserve knowledge may be a bit weaker than it actually looks. What we want to do instead is look more at the conciliation issue, because there seems to be something depth to this problem that hasn't been fully addressed yet. And that comes when we ask about what the conciliatory people might learn from their disagreement. Now, I said earlier that the conciliatory people, when they were or anybody who's an intellectual equal, I guess, in a disagreement, you've got the same evidence, the same background beliefs, and the same reasoning ability. So it seems that there's a lot in common. And the question that arises is, how could they disagree? And when we look at cases like the restaurant case, you say simple mistake somewhere. The only way you disagree is somebody made an obvious error. But in the hard cases, in the Neanderthal case or other cases we'll consider, I'm going to suggest there's more texture to the problem than we've seen so far. Let's look at the various dimensions along which disagreement might occur. We said they've got the same evidence, and we're thinking of this as some sort of database of facts. Okay. The question is, what are they making of this evidence? And one way they might disagree is by attaching different weight to different bits of evidence. So let's switch examples to see this, and we'll talk about two detectives who are trying to solve a crime. Sergeant Jones takes eyewitness reports to be very reliable, not completely reliable, but really quite reliable. And Sergeant James takes them not to be so reliable. So they've got the evidence of the eyewitness reports, and Jones is inclined to place more weight on them than James is. By attaching different weights to the evidence, they may arrive at different conclusions. Take another element that they may disagree about. The case against the suspect looks very strong. Sergeant Jones believes that the evidence is sufficient to show that Jeremy committed the theft. Sergeant James thinks that Jeremy might have been framed. The evidence is very strong, but it's strong because it was manufactured to make it look like Jeremy did the deed. So they attach different interpretations to the evidence. having the same evidence does not by itself ensure that people will interpret it the same way or weigh it the same way. So you can get disagreements on either of these two lines, and they may be perfectly rational disagreements. We have then background information. This theft was committed at 5:35 on a Tuesday. Well, that's in the middle of rush hour. Is that a significant fact or not? Sergeant Jones thinks it is, because that means that all of the suspects have very shaky alibis. Everybody says, I was on my way home from work. They probably were on their way home from work, but who knows? His opponent says rush hour has nothing to do with it. They both agree that it was rush hour, but whether that has any bearing on how you should interpret the evidence is something that they disagree about. And it may be a significant source of disagreement. And if you think about this, if you think about things like rush hour, you realize there are vast numbers of ways of describing the relevant background facts, as like what time it was, that may or may not be significant. So there's plenty of room for reasonable disagreement here. Does it matter that it was on a Tuesday? Maybe yes, maybe no. People might disagree. We could then look at reasoning style. We said they had the same reasoning abilities. And normally philosophers tend to think, okay, that's sort of like, they do the same deduction, they do the same induction, what more do you want? But it's not that easy. So, for example, suppose Sergeant Jones is somebody who likes to reason by analogy and thinks that strong analogies convey a lot of weight. And Sergeant James disagrees. He thinks that analogies are by nature weak modes of reasoning. He can do them, but he doesn't credit them all that much. So a tight analogical argument is likely to carry more weight with Jones than with James, even though they both have the ability to do that reasoning. They have different inclinations to do it and different inclinations to attach much significance to it. So here again, we've got a ground for reasonable disagreement. Then we have another dimension along which they might disagree, which is their assessment of the importance of various factors. And now I'll switch examples once again. In this case, let's do an athletic example, because we think about it, a lot of people disagree about athletic matters. So suppose Fred and Maude disagree about why the Broncos won the Super Bowl. Fred, while acknowledging the excellence of the quarterback, says the game was won by the defense. Maude, while acknowledging the excellence of the defense, says the game was won by the quarterback. They agree about every single fact. They disagree about the importance of these facts in assigning credit for the winning of this game. Now, this is an extraordinarily common mode of disagreement, and it's one that I think is very important because it doesn't only go with things like, arguing in bars about football games. It also could happen about things that are of arguably considerably more significance, like political matters. So suppose Gareth and Dan disagree about, say, whether the UK should leave the European Union. Dan is very concerned about economic matters. Gareth is very concerned about political matters. So Gareth puts a lot of weight on things like sovereignty, people's rights in different countries, things like that. And Dan is very concerned about economic matters like trade, flow of money and goods across national borders, things like that. They can agree about what all the consequences of this possible change would be and disagree about the importance of the various factors. And again, you can see that this is a perfectly reasoned disagreement. How important is this? How important is that? One of the things we should make of it is we should become attuned to it. We should become attuned to the ways in which these disagreements can be seated in different places. So that saying we disagree doesn't yet say what we're disagreeing about. And that, I think, is important for a couple of reasons. One is just because we tend to be talking past each other sometimes. But another is because of what is possible to learn from this disagreement. if we realize that a rational disagreement among competent intellectual equals can vary along all of these dimensions, then we can learn more about the situation we're disagreeing about by studying the disagreement, finding out where we disagree, finding out what the disagreement is. We may moderate our views. It might be that when when you get the case where somebody says, yes, but he might have been framed, you reassess your evidence entirely and say, yeah, maybe the evidence is looking a little bit too good here. That could be a problem. Maybe you moderate your views to something that neither one of you was initially inclined to think. So in the football case, they may come to agree that both the quarterback and the defense were absolutely critical to this win, in which case they come to conciliate on something that was neither one of their original commitments. Maybe they just suspend judgment by recognizing that the situation was vastly more complicated than they thought. So knowing how to weigh political versus economic concerns in the political question may just say, reading the paper once a week just doesn't give me enough information to make a reasonable judgment about this. All of these things are possible. And the thing that I want to recognize here is not that, talk about these things particularly as a way of coming to an agreement, but as a way of enhancing your understanding of the topic on which you're disagreeing. You know a whole lot more if you're open-minded and you investigate these issues and see on what basis could reasonable people disagree. So I'm suggesting here that if you are intellectually humble, then disagreement, rather than being something that requires resolution, may be a source of insight. It may be something valuable. But there's a benefit that actual disagreement has above and beyond what you can do just by shifting perspective, I think. And that's the following. Two benefits, I guess. One is that an intellectual equal actually disagrees with you is a reason to take that particular perspective seriously. There are an infinite number of perspectives, and some of them are frankly idiotic. And you probably shouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about them. But the news that somebody whose judgment you respect actually takes this one seriously gives you reason that you should do so too. So it puts intellectual weight on given perspectives. And the other is, I guess I just want to say that our imaginations are limited. So the number of perspectives any one of us can just individually shift to tends to be a bit restricted by our background experience, our upbringing, and so forth, in which case finding that others disagree with you outside of the range that you are comfortable about entertaining alternatives within is, again, a way of expanding your cognitive range. And this means that we do well to actually get more people to qualify as our intellectual equals. So if we expand the range of people we count, then we gain perspectives to take seriously. And that's an addition that's really quite important. This is a reason why when people talk about multiculturalism or talk about diversity of opinions and so forth, there's a strong intellectual argument for it because it will expand your range. It'll enable you to learn how to take seriously stuff that maybe you don't yet know how to do. And that's an advantage for you. So the suggestion then is that the intellectually humble person who takes disagreement seriously gains a lot in understanding, even if she loses something in knowledge. And it seems to me that's actually a trade-off that we should love.
As the world grows increasingly interconnected, the problems posed by religious pluralism are becoming increasingly urgent. In this lecture, Dr. Catherine Dormandy explores these issues and helps us consider whether or not a commitment to intellectual humility precludes religious fidelity or certain theological commitments. Catherine Dormandy is a research fellow at the University of Innsbruck. Her research is mainly in epistemology, moral psychology, and the philosophy of religion. She is now exploring the ramifications of cognitive biases for epistemic normativity in various areas, such as virtue epistemology and the philosophy of religion.
It's the year 2014. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is giving a speech to the General Synod of the Anglican Church, which is sharply divided over a number of doctrinal issues. In his speech, Welby pleads the bishops, priests, and lay people to engage in what he calls good disagreement. Now, with the term good disagreement, I take it that Welby was talking mainly about tolerating each other's views. Tolerance is an important goal, but it's not the only goal. It's also a very good thing for disagreeing people to resolve their disagreements. By this I mean two things. First, I mean that it's good to agree on the same belief. Second, it's good for that belief to be true. And this is what I'll talk about today, resolving disagreements, in particular about religion. By religion, I just mean disagreements about whether there is a transcendent or ultimate reality like God, and if so, what he or it is like. So this includes atheism as well as a variety of religious views. So what is a disagreement? It's when one person believes something and another person denies that very thing. Now, if it's really a disagreement, then somebody has to be mistaken. That's just logic. It can't be that God exists and that he doesn't exist. At least not when exists has the same meaning in both sentences. So the first step to resolving a disagreement is realizing that somebody has to be mistaken. Of course, neither person thinks it's them, and why should they? After all, it wouldn't be much of a belief if you didn't think it was true. But whether your belief is true or false, you have something to gain from resolving a disagreement. Now, the advantage is perhaps most obvious for the person with a false belief. She'll end up with a true one. But even if your belief is true, then you still stand to benefit from resolving your disagreement. For this will involve your interlocutor telling you why she believes what she does, and why she thinks you are mistaken. And this will challenge you to see things from her point of view, and to think hard about your own reasons for your own belief. And you may gain a better understanding of why your belief is true. So it's good for everybody involved to resolve a disagreement. But religious disagreements in particular are very hard to resolve. And the reason is that people are often personally, socially, and existentially invested in their beliefs about religion. And this leads us to have strong biases against different views to our own, or indeed against the people who profess those views. Bias tends to make us more deeply entrenched in our own beliefs and less interested in engaging constructively with people with different beliefs. So suppose we're interested in resolving a disagreement about religion, but realize that biases may get in the way. What do we do? A natural first step is to look at the parties' evidence. So far, so good, but drawing conclusions from evidence is not a straightforward matter. Now think of a jury trying to decide on the basis of the evidence whether to give a guilty verdict. The movie 12 Angry Men is a great illustration. Or think of two scientists debating which theory their evidence supports. And if we're biased, then our bias is going to affect the way we're disposed to weight our evidence to begin with. To see this, consider an illustration. Suppose you really like Sam, but your friend really doesn't like her. And suppose that Sam is driving and swerves her car. Because you are biased in favor of Sam, you conclude that the evidence of the swerve indicates that she must have been trying to avoid hitting something in the road. But your friend is biased against her, and he thinks that it indicates that she is reckless. So bias can affect the way we weight our evidence itself. So, if we want to resolve a disagreement about religion, evidence is only part of the answer. we need to agree on a way to weight our evidence that helps us minimize any bad effects of bias. That is, we have to find what I'll call an evidence weighting policy. This policy should help us with both aspects of resolution, coming to agreement and having what we agree to be a true belief. And if it is to do these things, it will have to find a way to deal with the effects of bias in the way we form beliefs. So I'm going to look at some evidence-weighting policies for beliefs about religion, and I will argue that one of them does the best job in managing bias so as to help us resolve religious disagreements. Let's begin with some clarifications of the terms we'll need. First, evidence. In everyday contexts, we think of evidence as physical things like DNA tests or documents. But these things can only provide information if we have some sort of mental access to them. We have to be aware of them. So this is why philosophers tend to use evidence to refer to the information which your mind grasps about the thing, rather than to the thing itself. There are two different forms which evidence might take. One form is what philosophers call seemings. A seeming is a perceptual experience or memory, such as seeing or remembering seeing a fingerprint. The second form of evidence is what you believe. So if you believe that a testifying witness is reliable, then this belief is part of your evidence for believing what that witness says. The difference between seemings and beliefs is this. A seeming is just an appearance, which you may or may not think is accurate. So a mirage is an example of a seeming which you don't think is accurate most of the time. A belief, on the other hand, is something you are committed to. You think it describes the world the way it is. And this gives a certain hierarchy to our evidence. Seemings tend to come first, and when we form judgments about them, about whether they're veridical, we get further beliefs, and these further beliefs can be themselves the basis for yet more beliefs. So this is what evidence is. But what's it for? Evidence is for trying to figure out what's true. This is what an evidence-weighting policy helps us do. An evidence-weighting policy can't, of course, guarantee a true belief, because evidence might be misleading. Just think of the mirage. But it should do the best it can. And it should do this for both parties to a disagreement. That is, an evidence-weighting policy should work to uphold somebody who starts off with a true belief, but it should also nudge somebody who starts with a false belief towards the truth, or at least not farther away from it than they were already. This will help us resolve a disagreement. So, one of the ways in which an evidence-weighting policy has to do this is by dealing with bias. To see how it might do this, we have to look a little bit more closely at biases themselves. So what is a bias? It's a tendency to associate concepts with each other, such as the concept dog and danger. When we have an association like this, we're disposed to form certain beliefs. For example, if we come across a dog, we'll tend to believe that it's dangerous. Sometimes, biases just cause us to form these beliefs without any evidence at all. But other times, they affect the beliefs that we form on the basis of evidence itself. How? Well, first, we saw in the previous segment that they affect the way that we weight our evidence. So whether you think Sam swerved her car for a good reason or just because she's reckless depends partly on whether you are biased for or against her. But second, biases can get into the very content of our evidence itself. How can they do this? Well, first, they can affect our seemings, our experiences and memories. So suppose I associate dishonesty with philosophy lecturers. Then, whenever I meet any particular philosophy lecturer, I'll be disposed to perceive her as a dishonest person. My perception will be colored by a sense of dishonesty. And the same goes for memories. When I remember meeting some person who's wearing blue, I might build a sense of dishonesty into it, even if it wasn't there to begin with. From here, we can easily see how bias might get into our belief evidence too. For when we have a seeming, we're naturally inclined to believe that things are as it represents them. So I'll be inclined to believe that a philosophy lecturer really is dishonest because I perceive her that way, and I have an association between dishonesty and philosophy lecturers. This is where an evidence-weighting policy comes in. It can't change my natural tendency to weight evidence, but it can tell me that that tendency is wrong. Similarly, an evidence-weighting policy cannot take the biases out of my seemings, but it can affect how I form beliefs on the basis of those seemings. It can say, for example, that you shouldn't always automatically form the beliefs that your seemings suggest. But an evidence-weighting policy has to be careful here, for it can't just say, don't form beliefs on the basis of biased seemings. The reason is that not all biases are bad. Our brains form biases because biases in turn help us form beliefs quickly when we need to, and often these beliefs are true. So if we associate umbrellas and rain, for example, we'll automatically form a true belief when we see rain that we should bring an umbrella. We won't need to think about it. So biases are like rules of thumb for our brains. But just like any rule of thumb, biases are blunt instruments. They can lead people astray too, including, in this case, to believing falsehoods. Why? Because biases aren't always responsive to the facts. Sometimes they come about because of our culture, emotions, our feelings of identifying with our community, or simply from what we always grew up believing. But this isn't all. Even biases that are responsive to the facts can sometimes lead us astray. That is, they can yield what I'm going to call false positive beliefs. Beliefs that are caused by bias and that are false even though we think that they're true. For example, people are programmed to associate motion with other people. So often when we hear a creaking door, we'll believe that someone's there. And often we'll be right, but sometimes we'll be wrong. It might just be a draft. So let me introduce some more terminology. When a bias associates two things that really are often associated, I'll call it a roughly reliable bias. Roughly because it can sometimes tempt us to form false positive beliefs too. And when a bias associates two things that aren't often associated, I'll call it an unreliable bias. Now let's apply these considerations to religious disagreements. I want to focus on two kinds of concepts that we can have biases about. First, there are religious concepts, for example, atheist, Muslim, Jew, Catholic, liberal, fundamentalist. Second, there are concepts about epistemology, that is, about truth, falsehood, or intellectual abilities. For example, we have the concepts of true, false, closed-minded, spiritually blind, enlightened, revealed by God. So it's very easy, indeed it's natural, for people to have biases which associate religious concepts on the one hand with epistemological concepts on the other. And this means that we can very easily and very automatically discredit another person or view simply because they disagree with us about religion. And it also means that we can think that our own evidence is much better than it actually is, simply because we strongly associate our own view or our own community with truth, rightness, or virtue. So whether religious and epistemological biases are roughly reliable or unreliable, we can see how they can pose a problem in resolving religious disagreements. They'll dispose us to being entrenched in our own view and to not being ready to listen to someone else's. So this is the situation which an evidence-weighting policy has to negotiate if it's going to help us resolve religious disagreements. It has to de-emphasize unreliable biases in our evidence, but it also has to let roughly reliable ones do their important cognitive work, at the same time protecting us from false positive beliefs. So this is going to be a tricky balance, and no evidence-weighting policy can get it perfectly right all the time. But it should be designed so as to do the best that it can. With all this in mind, I look at some evidence-weighting policies for beliefs about religion. I'll measure them on the basis of how well they meet the following constraint, which just summarizes what I've said so far. I'm calling it the resolution constraint. So an evidence-weighting policy for beliefs about religious matters must negotiate the doxastic effects of bias, that is, the effects on our beliefs, in a way which promotes the resolution of religious disagreements. The three evidence weighting policies differ over the amount of weight you should give to your public evidence as opposed to your private evidence in supporting a belief about religion. Your private evidence is anything which the other person can't agree with because of her own beliefs about religion. So suppose, for example, that you believe in God, whereas your interlocutor is an atheist, and suppose that you had a religious experience in which God seemed to be present to you. So your experience is private evidence for you, because the other person will think that that experience must have been non-veridical, like a mirage. God couldn't really have been present. Similarly, the other person's belief, so the atheist's belief that there is no God, is a piece of private evidence for her, because you believe in God, and so you have to think that belief's false. So your public evidence, on the other hand, is everything else, everything that's not private, everyday perceptual seemings that both of you are entitled to think are veridical, including experiences of the weather, of suffering, of any beliefs that don't have explicitly religious content. So what is it to say that one type of evidence weighs more heavily than the other? It just means that that one type of evidence tends to have a higher impact on the probability of a belief about religion, that it's a better indicator of whether that belief is true or false. For example, seeing raindrops usually weighs more heavily on the topic of whether it's raining than thinking that you vaguely remember the meteorologist predicting rain. Okay, so that's evidence and evidence weighting. Here's the first evidence weighting policy. It says that public evidence should get greater weight than private evidence, all else equal. So formally, I'm calling it publicism for this reason, and it says, in order for a belief about religious matters to be evidence proportioned, the subset of public evidence in an agent's set of total evidence should, all else equal, be accorded greater weight than the subset of private evidence. Publicists, people who hold this view, want to make sure that religious beliefs are as objective as possible, and their way of doing this is to say that it's good to hold them on the basis of considerations which as many people as possible can sign up to. So names that you'll associate with publicism include theists like John Locke, atheists like David Hume or Michael Martin, and agnostic positions like that of John Schellenberg. The second evidence weighting policy for beliefs about religion complains that publicism isn't fair to religious believers because so much of the evidence for believing in God happens to be private, they say, like scripture or religious experiences or the testimony of our community. So this second view says that you don't have to give public evidence greater weight. Instead, it's okay for you to adopt a policy of giving private evidence greater weight instead. And so I'm going to call the second view privatism. And that says this. In order for a belief about religious matters to be evidence proportioned, the subset of private evidence in an agent's set of total evidence may, all else equal, be accorded greater weight than the subset of public evidence. When we think of privatism, what's become known as reformed epistemology comes to mind. And here we think of theist philosophers primarily, like Alvin Plantinga, William Alston, and Nicholas Wolterstorff. The third view about weighting evidence for religious beliefs tries to find a middle ground between the others. It thinks that both kinds of evidence are equally important, and so says that they should both be weighted equally. And so for this reason, I'm calling it egalitarianism. And this view says the following. In order for a belief about religious matters to be evidence proportioned, the subsets of an agent's public evidence and of her private evidence should, all else equal, be accorded roughly equal weight. So names that you'll associate with egalitarianism include the theist philosophers like Richard Swinburne and John Greco. Let me call your attention to one thing about these three policies. Each one of them has an all else equal clause. This means that there are other things about evidence besides its being public or private which affect how much it weighs. One thing is how much evidence of the other kind you happen to have as well. So even if one kind weighs more, all else equal, if at some point you have a whole lot more of the other kind, then the other kind might outweigh the kind that generally weighs more. Another factor is how detailed your evidence is. So if one kind of evidence is a lot more detailed than the other, then this might increase its weight so that it outweighs the other. So for now, We're just setting these things aside and focusing only on the effects which being public or private has on the weight of evidence about religion. Let's see how well each evidence-weighting policy does in meeting the resolution constraint. So recall that there are two aspects to resolution. First, agreeing on the same belief, and second, having that belief be true. I'll start with privatism. This is the policy that says we're entitled to give our private evidence most of the weight in forming beliefs about religion. It's intuitively clear right away that this policy isn't going to foster agreement, and here's why. Private evidence is more susceptible to religion-related bias than public evidence. This is just because your private evidence is that part of your evidence which the other party is committed to thinking is mistaken. So this is the part that's going to include seemings that are heavily influenced by associations involving religious concepts. So privatism is going to encourage two disagreeing people to emphasize the evidence that most entrenches them in their respective disagreeing views. This includes a very important type of evidence about the very person who disagrees with you. Now, many belief systems contain private evidence which explains why other people don't hold those beliefs. For instance, atheists like Richard Dawkins think that theists believe in God only because they're psychologically weak and want a cosmic father figure to care for them. And theist philosophers, on the other hand, like Alvin Plantinga, might argue that atheists don't believe in God because their minds are clouded by the noetic effects of sin. In other words, private evidence includes any evidence that discredits people who disagree with you about religion. And since many belief systems have such private evidence, an evidence-weighting policy that lets us weight private evidence heavily will actively discourage us from taking people who disagree with us seriously. So in short, privatism scores pretty badly on the agreement part of the resolution constraint. But let's see if privatism does any better in helping disagreeing people form a true belief. So we can see right away that it won't help both disagreeing parties form a true belief, because it discourages them from agreeing, and remember, one party has to be mistaken in a disagreement. So at most, privatism can only help one party, and the party it's most likely to help is any person who has biases that are roughly reliable. If your biases are roughly reliable, then your private evidence will be fairly truth-conducive. And in this case, weighting it heavily will tend to give you some strong true beliefs, so confidently held true beliefs. This looks like a good result. But what about the other person whose biases are unreliable? This person's private evidence is unlikely to be very truth-conducive. So in letting her weight it heavily, privatism lets her sink ever deeper into error. And this is a very bad result. So in effect, we might even think that privatism is a form of epistemic elitism. It lets the people with true beliefs be very confident in them on the basis of their biased private evidence, at the expense of an epistemic underclass who is confident in their false beliefs on the basis of their biased evidence. However, when we look closer, we can see that the results aren't even so good for those who believe truly. Now, elites everywhere are susceptible to overconfidence in the power of their privilege, and the same holds for the epistemic elites of privatism. For remember that roughly reliable biases are only that, roughly reliable. They put us at risk of forming false positive beliefs. So even if our general convictions about religion are true, we might get quite a few of the particulars wrong. For example, suppose first that there's no God, okay? Suppose that I'm an atheist who is very confident in my atheism because of roughly reliable biases in my private evidence. And I'm also right about there being no God in this example. But my biases may also lead me to form certain false beliefs. For example, I might believe that a theist who disagrees with me won't have any good arguments for her position. After all, she's probably a theist because of wishful thinking. But now change the scenario. It works the other way too. Suppose that God does exist, and suppose that I am a confident theist, in part because of roughly reliable biases in my private evidence. Maybe God gave them to me to give me faith. So I'm right in general about God, but I might also form false positive beliefs. like the belief that God is speaking through this particular sermon, even if he isn't. So even if privatism lets me have a confident true belief on the basis of my private evidence, it will also let me down on many particulars because it doesn't push me to incorporate more neutral considerations. So not only does privatism not do anything to help the false believer, it's dangerous for the person believing truly as well. The privatist might object here, of course. So what if your private evidence just is much stronger than your public evidence? Surely it should be allowed to outweigh it sometimes. Think of the great mystics with powerful private evidence of God, like Teresa of Avila. We can't just say that she shouldn't be allowed to take that evidence really seriously. But this objection misconstrues my criticism. I'm not saying that private evidence never outweighs public evidence. All I'm saying is that it cannot be allowed to do so as a matter of policy. So remember the all else equal clauses in the 3 evidence weighting policies. We saw that there are other factors which affect the weight of evidence besides its being public or private. If the private evidence of the mystic outweighs other evidence she may have against believing in God, it's not because it's private evidence. It's because of some other amazing qualities her evidence has, such as being highly detailed, forceful, or plentiful. So, privatism does very poorly with agreement and has very problematic results when it comes to truth as well. Let's turn to publicism, the evidence weighting policy that says public evidence should get the most weight when it comes to religious beliefs. So publicism does very well in helping people who disagree about religion find common ground. Because bias about religion is mostly found in private evidence, publicism minimizes the influence of bias because it minimizes the influence of private evidence. This means that 2 disagreeing parties will have to use mainly evidence on which the other one can also agree. And because of this, publicism doesn't give you the opportunity to epistemically discredit the other person simply because she disagrees. Because any discrediting beliefs belong to your private evidence. This is a really good result as far as agreement is concerned. How about the truth aspect of resolution? Can publicism also push both people in the direction of a true belief? So publicism tends in exactly the opposite direction to privatism here. It's radically progressive, whereas I called privatism elitist. Publicism starts everybody off with epistemic resources that are roughly on a par, the evidence that both parties are at liberty to sign up to. The result is that although the parties are more likely to agree, they are less likely to agree on what's true. Instead, they're more likely to agree on something like agnosticism, or the belief that the evidence is inconclusive. Why? Because the advantage of publicism is also its drawback. Public evidence is neutral of religious content, but because of this, it's probably too neutral to decide the question of religious beliefs either way. This might surprise some people who think that there are sound arguments for the existence or non-existence of God which rely on public evidence premises. For the existence of God, there are the ontological arguments, teleological arguments, and cosmological arguments. And against the existence of God, there are the arguments from suffering, from divine hiddenness, and from religious diversity. But that's just the problem. There are so many good arguments on both sides. And many of these arguments are highly technical. For example, the ontological argument hinges on a claim about which system of modal logic is the best for reasoning about transcendent reality. That's pretty complex. And even the argument from suffering, which you would think is pretty simple, relies on controversial claims about reasons which God might or might not have, which are unfathomable to us mortals. So it's hard to see how an argument relying on such controversial matters can really justify belief, rather than just provisional acceptance as a working hypothesis. And if the arguments don't justify belief, then they, of course, don't justify true belief. At best, we'll get agreement about what degree of uncertainty we should have given highly controversial evidence. But publicism is a lot better than privatism for the person who starts off with a false belief because of unreliable biases. So privatism said it was okay for this person to have a false belief. But publicism moves her towards agnosticism instead, and this is at least a move away from a falsehood, even if it's not entirely to a truth. But what about the person who starts off with a true belief because of roughly reliable biases? So in one respect, publicism is bad for this person, because his confidence is pushed away from a truth and towards agnosticism. But in another respect, it's not so bad after all, because at least he'll be pushed away from false positive beliefs too. So publicism doesn't promote the true belief envisioned by the resolution constraint, but it does have a silver lining for both parties. Still, it would be nice if we could have a view that gets us agreement and true belief at the same time. Let's see how egalitarianism does. So recall that egalitarianism says that public and private evidence should get equal weight, because both are equally important. So on the one hand, public evidence provides common ground and dilutes our biased private evidence. And on the other hand, private evidence is important because it's a unique vehicle for information that comes from any biases that might be roughly reliable, as long as we're careful not to weight it too heavily. So let's see how egalitarianism does with the agreement part of resolution. First, it does better than privatism, because privatism, as we saw, gave biases full sway, leading to entrenchment on both sides. Egalitarianism says that we have to temper our private evidence with our public evidence. So, two disagreeing parties will probably wind up closer to each other in their beliefs, given egalitarianism than given privatism. But egalitarianism isn't quite as good as publicism, because as we saw on agreement, publicism gives private evidence an even smaller role, and this will tend to push people's beliefs or levels of confidence even closer. So publicism still wins on agreement, but egalitarianism is in second place. Let's see how egalitarianism does with the truth aspect. First, it's better than privatism. Consider first the person who starts off with a false belief. Egalitarianism makes her dilute her private evidence with more neutral public evidence, and this will tend to push her away from a false belief, even if she might still hold it weakly. Privatism, on the other hand, we saw, lets her remain very confident in her false belief. So it's better for the person believing falsely. But what about the person who starts off with a true belief? Egalitarianism is better for him too, better than privatism anyway. Granted, it pushes him away from a true belief because it makes him dilute his reliable private evidence, but his private evidence still gets half the weight, so he might well end up keeping his belief, just somewhat less confidently. And this is going to be good for many of his other beliefs too, because they're less likely to be false positives. He'll have to hold them on a combination of public and private evidence. Now, how does egalitarianism compare with publicism on truth? First, egalitarianism is better for the person who has a true belief because of his roughly reliable biases. For as we saw, this person's private evidence gets to play a larger role than on publicism, so if he starts off with a confident true belief, egalitarianism is fairly likely to let him keep at least a somewhat less confident true belief. Publicism, on the other hand, tends to push him much closer to agnosticism. But egalitarianism is worse than publicism for the person who starts off with a false belief due to unreliable biases, for the same reason. Publicism pushes him towards agnosticism, which is better than false belief, but egalitarianism is more likely to let him keep a false belief, even if it's not a super confident one. So in short, whereas publicism totally levels the playing field between the disagreeing parties, egalitarianism still has an advantage for the true believing person. That said, it's less of an advantage than with privatism, because these beliefs will tend to be less confident. In summary, egalitarianism is in every way better than privatism, on agreement and truth. But in comparison with publicism, on agreement, egalitarianism is somewhat inferior, whereas on truth, it's better for the true believer, but worse for the false believer. So the competition seems to be between egalitarianism and publicism. This isn't a clear-cut result. What should we do? Well, I think we should pick egalitarianism. It's moderately more polarizing than publicism, but at least it leaves room for some evidence-proportioned true belief about religion. And this is really important, because if nobody has a true belief, then we're stuck. Dialogue won't yield any progress at all towards the truth. So egalitarianism is the only view which gives us enough disagreement to make dialogue worthwhile, but not so much that we won't want to engage with people who disagree with us. But there's still more which egalitarianism could do to take full advantage of the disagreement itself. I'll finish by suggesting an improvement that will put it in a better place to promote agreement as well as truth for both parties to a religious disagreement. I want to finish by suggesting an improvement to egalitarianism. As it stands, it and the other views we've looked at only tell you how to handle your own evidence. But a person who disagrees with you has a whole bunch of evidence of her own, and her evidence will be really different to yours. Now, this is partly because she has different biases to you, and partly because she's had lots of different experiences to you. If we ignore the other person's evidence, we're potentially missing information on a big chunk of reality that she has come into contact with and we haven't. So if we want to take full advantage of the disagreement, then we'll want to see how her evidence bears on our religious belief. So I'm going to suggest an upgraded version of egalitarianism. Here's the first pass, which I'll refine in just a minute. So in addition to weighting your own private and public evidence about the same, I suggest that you should also take the other person's evidence, and in particular her private evidence, into account. So Egalitarianism 2.0, which is my name for this upgrade, adds the following clause. It says that the private evidence of a disagreeing interlocutor with whom you are engaging should, all else equal, be accorded at least non-negligible weight. Now this might sound crazy. Remember, you're committed to thinking that your interlocutor's private evidence is false, or at least non-veridical. How can you give it any weight at all? Well, here's how. If you think something is false, this doesn't have to mean that you think it's also totally impossible. For example, if you haven't looked out the window yet, but you think it's sunny, if I keep pressing you, you may well say, okay, well, I'm not totally sure it's sunny. Now, this not totally sure is all we need. So say I'm an atheist and you are a theist, and you have some private evidence of an experience of God's presence that you had. Now, I'm not saying that as an atheist, I really have to believe that God was present to you. All I have to do is admit that I can't be totally sure that he wasn't. And because I can't be totally sure, I have to give your experience at least a very little bit of weight, what I called non-negligible weight. Now, this won't be much weight at all, of course, but it's still something to make me, the atheist, think harder about why I don't believe in God. But hang on, what if the person you disagree with has totally absurd private evidence? To take Alvin Plantinga's example, what if he believes that the Great Pumpkin comes to visit children every Halloween? And what if he bases this belief on a mystical Great Pumpkin experience that he had? I surely can't be saying that you have to give this person's private evidence of the Great Pumpkin even non-negligible weight. And indeed, I'm not saying this. Clause B, the new bit that I've added to egalitarianism, has an all else equal clause itself. So you only have to give non-negligible weight to the other person's private evidence when certain other factors don't arise. Now let me spell these out. Suppose you have good evidence for thinking that the other person is being dishonest in reporting her evidence, or that she formed her belief when she was drunk, or suppose you have good evidence to think she regularly hallucinates. This sort of thing gives you good reason to take her evidence less seriously than you otherwise might. In this case, I'll say that you have good reason to think that this person is epistemically unviable. Here's a more specific definition of epistemic unviability. Your interlocutor is epistemically unviable if and only if 1. She is dishonest in reporting either her belief about religious matters or her evidence for it. 2. Her cognitive faculties are unreliable. 3. She has formed her belief irrationally. 4. Her evidence is deficient in quality or quantity. So if your own evidence, on an equal weighting of the public and private bits, of course, leads you to believe that the other person is unviable in any of these respects, you are exempted from giving any weight to her private evidence at all. This means if her private evidence is an experience of the Great Pumpkin, you don't have to incorporate it into your own reasoning. But this bumps us up against a different objection. Remember that religious and atheist belief systems have explanations for why people who disagree with them are mistaken. So think of the atheist whose private evidence says that theists are wishful thinkers, and think of the theist whose private evidence says that atheist thinking is clouded by sin. Egalitarianism 2.0 is like the original egalitarianism. It gives equal weight to evidence like this. And this might just be enough in some cases to think that a person who disagrees with you is epistemically unviable. But if this is so, then it's going to be all too easy to have an excuse not to take the other person's private evidence seriously. It's going to be all too easy to believe that she's epistemically unviable. Because of this, I want to suggest a final upgrade. It's the same as Egalitarianism 2.0, except that it tweaks Clause B by laying down a more robust condition. It says that you not only have to see whether your interlocutor is epistemically unviable on your evidence, but you also have to look carefully at whether you are epistemically unviable on her evidence. Here's the tweak. The private evidence of a disagreeing interlocutor with whom you are engaging should be accorded at least non-negligible weight if and only if you have no more evidence that she is epistemically unviable than she has that you are. Egalitarianism 2.1, which is my upgrade now, notices that there is a structural similarity between you and a person who disagrees with you, and it takes advantage of this. 2.1 says that you cannot just use your private theory to discredit your interlocutor, but by the same token, she cannot use hers to discredit you, unless there's something that breaks the symmetry between you. So you've got to take a good look at your own epistemic viability from her perspective before you're entitled to discredit her viability. This is just a kind of epistemological challenge, to take the log out of your own eye first. So if your interlocutor is a Great Pumpkin believer, then chances are that you will be entitled to think she's unviable. For example, chances are she will be relying too heavily on her own private evidence, her Great Pumpkin experience. But if he is not a Great Pumpkin believer, then it's going to be harder for you to use your own belief system to automatically discredit her. Egalitarianism 2.1 does well in resolving religious disagreements. So first, on the agreement part, it compels each person to look at the other person's evidence too. This will at least encourage them to see where the other person's coming from, and it will help encourage agreement. Second, Egalitarianism 2.1 does pretty well on the truth aspect too. Why? Because it has the advantages of the original egalitarianism, but it also gives both parties more evidence than they had before. And more evidence in general gives you a more balanced and representative picture of reality. So we've reached the end of my discussion. Let me sum up where we've got to. We've seen that resolving disagreements is good for both parties, but that resolving disagreements about religion is especially hard. This is because bias not only affects the way we're naturally inclined to weight our evidence, but it gets into the very seemings and beliefs that make up our evidence itself. I've looked at the three main evidence-weighting policies in the philosophy of religion literature. There are lots of arguments for each policy which I didn't have the time to consider, and I encourage you to read up on them on your own. But judged only in the light of how well they deal with bias in resolving religious disagreements, I've argued that egalitarianism does the best job, especially with the additions that I've made to it to get us egalitarianism 2.1. So public and private evidence should get roughly equal weight in supporting our beliefs about religion, and we should also consider the private evidence of the other party, at least when we have no reason to think that she is any more epistemically unviable than she has to think that we are.